Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled Progressivism and the Activist State. In order to answer the question, did World War I spell the end of the progressive era or merely change its methods? We have to understand the changes that the progressives sought in American society, broadly defined, and the way they pursued those changes. Although historians have defined the progressivism of the progressive era in conflicting ways, one of the things they all agree upon is that progressives sought to have government play an active but beneficial role in people's lives. This lecture examines how progressives imposed an activist state by taking control of the many levers of power, particularly at the federal level. We've already spoken about some of the domestic policies of the era's first president, Theodore Roosevelt, and we've examined the foreign policy of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. But let's begin this study with the important election of 1912, for that's where progressivism beat back the old guard conservatives to the right and halted the influence of the socialists to the left. Indeed, the 1912 election was an American political watershed, a rare election in which serious policy issues were debated and the nation made choices with long-term significant consequences. And let me add that we see this in hindsight. At the time, people did understand that they were making significant choices and they were changing the direction of the country, but it is not neat and packaged and all over with just with a single election. The candidates were Eugene Debs for the Socialist Party, gaining more votes than any socialist before or after him, William Howard Taft for the GOP, Teddy Roosevelt for the Progressive Party, and Woodrow Wilson for the Democrats. The run-up to the election began in earnest in 1910 during Taft's presidential term. Theodore Roosevelt had handpicked Taft as his successor, but split with him over a number of problems he thought meant that Taft was not progressive enough. You can make a compelling argument that Roosevelt wanted to be president again anyway. Taft adhered to Roosevelt's agenda in many ways. Taft's Attorney General filed 90 antitrust suits, almost double the number filed by Roosevelt, which was 54. Campaign finance reform passed during Taft's presidency. He signed legislation allowing for a postal banking system to give working people a place to bank and where they could save small amounts of money. The 16th Amendment, allowing Congress to levy income taxes, passed during his administration. It was passed by Congress July 2, 1909, and ratified on February 3, 1913. This was an idea that progressives picked up from the populist St. Louis Platform of 1892. The 17th Amendment, that allowed direct election of senators, passed during his administration, but was not ratified until early in Woodrow Wilson's presidency. In fact, it passed Congress on May 13, 1912, and it was ratified on April 8, 1913. Formerly, state legislatures had elected senators. Yet we don't think of Taft as a progressive. Taft did not allow GOP progressives to take over the party, thus ensuring a split. He allied with the conservative so-called old guard. He supported long-term Speaker of the House Joseph Cannon, who was overly powerful and a representative from Illinois. And until 2006, Cannon was the longest-serving Speaker of the House, surpassed by Denny Hastert. And he might have been the most powerful speaker ever. He was also roundly hated by progressive Republicans and by Democrats. Taft supported Senator Nelson Aldrich, a GOPer from Rhode Island, who wielded almost as much power in the Senate as Cannon did in the House, and he supported the Payne-Aldrich tariff of 1909 that rubbed free trader progressives the wrong way and that buried favors under a mountain of rubbish, thereby duping supporters and opponents both. Roosevelt probably decided to run when Taft refused to support TR's friend, National Forester Gifford Pinchot, in a row with his boss, Secretary of Interior Richard Ballinger, in 1910. This is called the Ballinger-Pinchot controversy. Ballinger, the Secretary of the Interior, used his position to give public land to private corporations, and Pinchot accused him of accepting bribes, and, as they say, that's when the fight started. Pinchot lost, but it led TR to throw his hat into the ring for 1912. The 1912 election turned into a four-candidate race when Roosevelt bolted the GOP and created his Progressive Party, also called the Bull Moose Party. The Socialist candidate was Eugene Debs, the GOP candidate was Taft, the Progressive candidate was Roosevelt, and the Democratic candidate was Woodrow Wilson. Let's look at the platforms of these four parties. The Socialist Platform asked for government ownership and/or management of all large industries. Socialists wanted government control of banking and a graduated income tax. They wanted public works programs for the unemployed. They wanted a minimum wage, retirement pensions, disability insurance. They also wanted direct election of the president, the vice president, and senators. Remember, in 1912, senators were still elected by their state legislatures, and the president and vice president continue today to be elected not by the people, but by the Electoral College. And the socialists wanted women's suffrage. For its part, the Republicans wanted to expand and define unfair business practices. They supported the Federal Trade Commission. They wanted to retain protective tariffs. This is one of the things that really set them apart from both the Democrats and the progressives. They wanted a tariff board. They wanted to retain the gold standard for money, but they also wanted to provide credit to farmers. They wanted to prohibit corporate donations to political campaigns, which was also a progressive idea. And they wanted to prohibit undesirable immigration that they defined in many different ways. The Bull Moose and the Democratic Party platforms, and indeed the candidacies of Bull Moose or Roosevelt and Democrat Woodrow Wilson, were where the action was. These were the two choices. The socialist, Eugene Debs, was not going to win, and it was pretty obvious from the beginning that Taft was not going to win either. The real election of 1912 hinged between two different conceptions of where America was at that point in the 19-teens. The Bull Moosers, that is the progressives, had a concept of the role of government that was summed up by Theodore Roosevelt's idea of new nationalism. Now, the tenets of new nationalism are that the old Jeffersonian belief in small government had to yield to the idea that government was the only countervailing power capable of standing against corporate might. Americans also had to abandon the Whig belief that government is the most potent enemy of freedom. Government indeed has a positive role to play in making life better. They accommodated corporate structures. Corporations were here to stay. The idea of regulating corporations came forward. The Democrats proposed a concept of government summed up in new freedom. According to Wilson, the federal government should cripple the corporate form to eradicate the ability of trusts and holding companies to be created. This would invigorate competition and lower barriers to entry into competition. Then the federal government was to disappear to its former small self, leaving control of the economy to the free market dominated by small competitive businesses. And political decision-making was to be left to communities and states. So how did this play out in the Bull Moose platform? The Bull Moosers, under Theodore Roosevelt, wanted direct primaries. This was a new idea. They wanted the direct election of senators. They wanted initiative, referendum, and recall. Initiative allowed the people to petition their legislatures to have bills introduced directly, did not have to go through a legislator to get introduced into the body. Referendum even bypassed the legislature and asked for the right to vote on measures proposed by the people. And recall was the idea that if someone was so egregiously bad in their office that they couldn't possibly make it to the next election, that the people had the right to have them taken out of office by a vote. Bull Moosers wanted women's suffrage. They wanted a limit to corporate campaign contributions. They wanted the 8-hour day and a living wage for workers. They wanted social insurance. They wanted the Federal Trade Commission and the Tariff Board to control tariffs and interstate trade. The Democratic platform was much longer. They wanted no protective tariff at all. They wanted legislation that crippled corporations. They believed in states' rights, but they also believed in an income tax. They too wanted direct election of senators and presidential primaries. They wanted a prohibition on corporate contributions to campaigns. That went across all 4 of the campaigns. They wanted the presidents limited to a single presidential term. They wanted to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission. There would be no central bank. Government banking went to the highest bidder rather than to political favorites. They wanted restrictions on injunctions in labor disputes, which were being used by corporations to muzzle labor. They wanted a Department of Labor to be created. So let me summarize very quickly here. Wilson won the election, and though he tried throughout his entire 2 terms to implement the new freedom, he ended up implementing much of Theodore Roosevelt's new nationalism. So we see the federal government nudged toward becoming activist, at least in trying to regulate corporate rapaciousness and trying to do large projects that the states and localities did not have the capacity to accomplish, like funding a highway system, imposing national prohibition, and giving women the right to vote. Wilson left many things undone that the federal government might have accomplished, like halting lynchings with a federal anti-lynch law. From 1917 through 1920, we see this trend of activist government merge with other progressive era trends in prosecuting what was the first total war in United States history, outside of the fact that the Confederates prosecuted the U.S. Civil War as a total war. This is the end of the lecture, and as always, thank you for your attention.